Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and a very, very warm welcome to day 2 of the SARB Payments Conference 2024. Other than to say that let's take a lot of what came out of yesterday and build on it in the conversations. We'll recall that the focus for the first day was really looking at a payments landscape that was innovative, that was modernized, that was digital, that was responsive, that put the consumer at the center. And so as we shift our focus today to start looking at payment systems that are safe, that are reliable, that are resilient, that are sustainable, that we do the job of threading what came out of yesterday and saying, how do we do both and? And we're going to see this coming through in a lot of the conversations as we try to wrestle with what are the necessary trade-offs that would then need to be made, and how do we make sure that we achieve access while we achieve safety and security at the very same time. So our first speaker this morning, Deputy Governor Cassim, is going to come up and going to do two things for us. One is to give us the frame for today's conversation on this, focusing on what does it mean to build a safer, more stable, more resilient, and more sustainable payment system, but also lifting up some of the insights and the key messages from day one that we'd like to keep on our radar and top of mind as we engage today. And so, without further ado, please won't you help me welcome with a warm round of applause Deputy Governor Rashad Cassim as he comes up to the podium, please. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. So I guess Tim felt a bit guilty. Since the governor did the opening address, he should find some airtime for the deputy governor responsible for payments. I should say that we spent important time yesterday looking at, obviously, the cheaper, faster, inclusive payment systems. I think that these themes will continue to dominate our discussion today, but as Nozipo rightly points out, will veer towards justifiably what has become an obsession in the payments world, which is safety, resilience. And the nightmare question, I guess, we all think about is how prepared are we when something goes wrong? Someone asked me, I think it was Geeta, are you staying for the whole 2 days? And I said, well, you know, I'm a student of payments amongst many mentors, and I need to become familiar with the critical policy issues. You know, as governors, we get helicoptered into one area, we move out of areas, we can never be the experts. So I thought I would give you my impressions, really as a non-expert in payments, with a slight economist financial markets vantage point. Incidentally, given my personal responsibility as SARB, that I have to grapple with payments at two levels. The first is, you know, domestically, what do we do with payments? And the second is, we're part of a global group called the G20, and we will be chairing it next year, and cross-border payments is the issue in the G20. Now, as a novice in this area, I grappled with how to think about payments in the economy. And if you can indulge me, I'll give you a sense of I think about it, and you can determine whether I've got it wrong or right, seeing that I'm a student of payments. Economists have forever been preoccupied with an important area of research, and that is how important is the financial sector to economic growth. Not surprisingly, empirical work has shown that a sound and deep financial sector is an important catalyst to long-term growth. But, you know, the real question is, where does payments fall in this? Now, you know, one of the most basic functions of the financial system is to provide efficient mechanisms to make and receive payments. By reducing transaction costs, it facilitates trade. Now, a very famous Nobel laureate in economics, Rob Merton, laid out the role of the financial sector in a very nice way. And to quote him, he says that the financial sector plays an important role in identifying and supporting valuable investments, providing signals for an efficient allocation of resources, monitoring the use of these resources, managing risk and uncertainty. These functions involve pooling funds, diversifying risk, and engaging in risk transformation. But for the financial sector to effectively play this role, there is an assumption that underlying this is an efficient and cost-effective payments system. And payment system is an activity like credit extension, like lending. But we also more recently discovered that payments contribute to economic growth, not only from an efficient infrastructure point of view, but through financial inclusion by stimulating economic activity. Yesterday, I think that we converge on three broad areas. The one was the world of wholesale payments. Some facets of wholesale payments are less controversial today. Where it is controversial is how does wholesale payments, in terms of access, engage with retail, with the newly escalated retail payments. So that was one area we talked about to some extent. The second area we talked about was the topic, and that is the world of fast retail payments. And we talk about innovation in the financial sector. If ever there was innovation in the financial sector, it is obviously in the area of payments. The third area which touched on, and we didn't go into in that much detail for very good reason, and that is the regional and cross-border payments. It's quite interesting that South Africa will be the president of the G20. Previous to South Africa, you had Brazil, India and Brazil. Both countries have been highly successful in their domestic payment system and are spending enormous effort translating that into cross-border. Countries like South Africa are dealing with the domestic system. But along these three broad areas, what was an overlay with these three broad areas was the role of technology in payment systems. And we heard yesterday that in some cases technology is the least of our problems. A bigger stumbling block is governance, business models. But I think what has become complicated for payments is the standard question in policy circles is when you talk about the potential of new technologies like distributed ledger technology and so CBDC, which is both a construct and a technology. The question asked is why would you even think about new technology like CBDCs, retail CBDCs, when you have an effective payment system built on traditional technology? And there is a view that countries who don't have an efficient and effective system, traditional system, have the ability to leapfrog, and there are opportunities. These opportunities should not be underestimated, although there is still some skepticism about this. On top of this, it's very hard to avoid a conference today, especially in finance, but not only in finance, on where does AI feature. We touched on it. We didn't develop it much. It's not a conference on AI, but it is something we cannot miss. Now, personally, from where I sit, one of the most important conversations we had yesterday was on the role of the central bank in the modernization and digitization of our system. And I think that the contrasting approaches of the wholesale payment space versus the retail payment space is a convenient opportunity to kind of address some of the fundamental questions like the role of the central bank in shaping the payment system. But it's also valuable in addressing other fundamental questions like, how do financial stability risks play out in the wholesale payments versus the fast payment system? And then the important topic for today, do we need a different mindset to think about risk management approaches to cyber in the two different ecosystems? Is this a fundamental change? Is it a degree? Is it scale? Is it qualitative? Now, if your life is as dull and as boring as mine, and you spend a lot of time watching YouTube on various conferences, I listened to a very lucid American academic, Charles Kahn, who spoke at a recent conference on the economics of payments in Vienna, and I discovered at least 3 or 4 people who were at this conference a week or 2 ago. Charles started his lecture with a question saying the most pressing questions in payments is that as new innovation unfolds, what is the market structure of the payment system in the economy going to be? In economics, this is often referred to as industrial organization questions. And his response to that question was that one of the roles of government is to break up the incumbent club, to quote him directly, and the second role is to coordinate the adaptation, the adoption of technology. Now, when he says break up the incumbent club, this is more complicated. It's not a bunch of incumbents who are deliberately putting barriers to entry. That may exist, but it's a very complicated business, as we heard yesterday, to get access to a payment system with schemes and rules and so on. The second point he made is that the adoption of technology is a critical area. And there are 2 things, 2 facets to the adoption of technology. One is how you monitor the SARB, how you monitor the central bank in adopting its technology, particularly in the fast payments, in the wholesale payment space. How accountable is how does the central bank think about ensuring that it's keeping up with technology? An analyst, Morton Beck, at the BIS Bank for International, has written a lot about that. On the other hand, how does the central bank coordinate the adoption of technology, particularly when you have the growth of a fast payment system? Now, I think that, when we think of the role of the central bank, and I was triggered, I took copious notes yesterday. When we think of the role of the central bank, the wholesale payment system is well defined in a central bank, specifically in its relation to the commercial interbank market, and it forms part of the original purpose of the very existence of the central bank and is universal practice. Now, thinking about safety and security, it may not be a bad idea to remind ourselves of some important developments in the wholesale space and see how this will play out in the retail. Now, many of you know that central banks, out of concern for liquidity risk, particularly in the 90s, moved from net to gross settlement. As you may recall, banks had implicit agreements to settle on a net basis, but as volumes picked up, as values picked up, there were concerns of being vulnerable to liquidity and systemic risk. How, for example, the failure of one bank to settle might result in multiple settlement failures. By contrast, real-time gross settlement system, in the real-time gross settlement system, each payment by a bank to another bank consists of an irrevocable transfer of central bank funds. This was a major leap. It eliminated settlement risk from one participant failing and had the advantage of insulating an individual payee from systemic risk. This was a really important leap in safety and security, but had to come with many things. Central banks had to develop proper collateral frameworks. They require more liquidity, intraday liquidity was required. You had to deal with the credit risk framework, and so on. But nevertheless, the question to ask is, despite this major leap in dealing with the risks of net settlement, it exists in some central banks till today. The question is, how different are these challenges in getting a fast retail system off the ground? We know that important security or safety questions in wholesale payments are liquidity and systemic risk. What we've learned from our conversations with India, from our conversations with Brazil, and a few others, that one of the most important risks of a scaled-up payment system is fraud. And there is some advantage about being a laggard in this area, that we can pay more attention to fraud than we would have had we done this before India. And I think a second issue that many of them raise is a competition issue, which is not so much, I mean, at one level, competition issues is about important, but it also, the nature of market structure in fast payments leads to concentration. 2-3 companies dominate the back end of many fast payment systems. So that is where we are at, and I think that these are the challenges I'll finish shortly. These are the challenges for fast payments. We heard yesterday that there are many models of retail fast payment systems. There is no guiding principle on fast payment retail systems. No central bank, in my conversations with central banks, started off saying, this is our preconceived notion about what role we as the central bank are going to play in the fast payment system. In fact, the default option was that this is best done by the private sector, and that is correct. But models changed from those default options. There was some reference yesterday to how models change, and there are very different models if you compare Turkey, Brazil, Kenya, Thailand, very, very different models. But this then went into the discussion of the role of the central bank as the operator, overseer, catalyst. Very much standard textbook stuff in payments. These roles obviously have evolved considerably in different settings. I think the jury is still out on how much of the success of scaled-up payment systems depended on one or two? Was there one dominant factor? Was there a combination of factors and so on? And that's more research, and it's very different in different settings. But what is the role of appropriate legislation? Tim set out how we're trying to do things despite the delay of legislation. But I think the lesson we take out of this is it is important for the SARB to continue to review its role in payments and to assess whether the status quo is relevant or not, and decide how it allocates its resources and its priorities in operations and so on. And I think that symbiotic relationship that exists in the wholesale space should be translated in the fast payments case. More complicated, many more people. There's the non-bank sector, which is a very important part, and access, obviously, is a very important part. Let me just conclude by saying that there are a few important developments in the area of risk that the bank is taking on. Not surprisingly, the much-weighted law on our new regulatory approach will be activity-based, focusing on risk exposure and ensuring that rules of a specific payment activity are applicable to payment institutions, irrespective of their type, whether they're banks or non-banks, as long as they engage in the payment activity. The SARB is also publishing a directive, published a directive which imposes cyber security and cyber resilience requirements. Very difficult, one of the most difficult, because it assumes we have all the knowledge on cyber governance, detection, response, and so on. We may not have all the knowledge, but we have the coordinating power, and our ability to have a resilient cyber framework really depends on our ability to harness the expertise that exists in this country and some of the international experts. Internally, the SARB has been doing some stress testing. For example, in our SEDEC RTGS settlement ecosystem service, we've done some stress testing where the SEDEC RTGS provides a third-level contingency settlement service to SEDEC central banks in the event that their domestic RTGS are not available to provide settlement services to participate and settle their domestic payments obligations. Internationally, we participate in many common standards on cyber information. And I think that in the end, all these initiatives, we must not lose sight of the fact what came out yesterday is that at the end of the day, we want to do it really for financial inclusion, economic growth, and many others. And I hope that we have an equally interesting discussion today as we had yesterday. Thank you very much.
Deputy Governor, I've been advised that in the interest of time, we'll spare you a Q&A. So thank you very much. Let's give the Deputy Governor a very, very big round of applause. Thank you very much. More specifically, DG, thank you very much for really doing the work of threading and converging the themes from day one and the focus, of course, for today of day two by taking us on a journey that allows us to reflect on the evolution of risks in the payment systems and how we've responded to those and the opportunity to respond even better, faster, and more accurately.